Okay, the floor is yours, Joe.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's always great being here with you, and I appreciate you spending your morning with us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Joe Greger, and I am the small business focal point for DCAA. And I guess I can kind of go through my bio a little bit. I started my career with DCAA. Actually, it'll be 20 years. It'll be 20 years next March, so which isn't too far off. I moved from Pittsburgh to Northern Virginia to accept a position with DCAA. I started off as an auditor, and then worked my way up through the ranks, like many of us. Supervisory auditor was my next promotion, and then branch manager after that. And then about 4.5 years ago now, I rotated into my current position as the small business focal point, and I've been enjoying it ever since. So, like I mentioned, I'm located in Northern Virginia, and I work at DCAA Headquarters, which is Fort Belvoir, Virginia. And some of you might have heard of Fort Belvoir. If not, then it's not too far from DC. It's about 25 miles outside of Washington, DC. So that's a little bit about myself. I think we have a great topic today: monitoring subcontracts. And I was kind of thinking about this before I logged into the webinar. One of the many questions that I get from small businesses, not necessarily about monitoring subcontracts, but just through my discussions and based on my experience, I do find that a lot of businesses are not sure, or they don't even know, or not, or they don't have the awareness about what their responsibilities are when they have subcontracts, right? So basically, your responsibilities as a prime, right? And that's what we'll talk about today in this presentation. Okay, so I'll go over some of your responsibilities as a prime or higher tier subcontractor. And what I mean by a higher tier subcontractor, think of a situation where you have the prime contractor has the contract with the federal government, but in many situations the prime might have a first tier sub, and then even there might be a second tier sub, and even a third tier sub, and so on and so forth. So all of those first, second, third tier subcontractors, if they have subcontractors underneath them, then many times you are referred to as the higher tier subcontractor. So just wanted to clarify that. And so, like I said, we'll talk about the responsibility. And these responsibilities, by the way, like I said, they fall on the prime, but also if you're also considered a higher tier subcontractor. So we'll talk about that as we move into the presentation. So let me talk about subcontract responsibility, right? So it is generally the responsibility of the prime contractor, again, or higher tier sub, to make sure that they use subcontractors that are able to responsibly perform on the contract. And this requirement comes from FAR 9.104-4. And if you look at it, essentially it says what I said. Generally, prospective primes are responsible for determining the responsibility of their subcontractors, right? Now, what is responsibility, right? I'm kind of using quotes, obviously you can't see me, but if I was in person, I would be using the term responsibility in quotes. So what does that mean? What is the criteria for responsible? So, like I mentioned, as a prime or upper tier, you're responsible for ensuring that the subcontractor is a responsible subcontractor, right? So what does that mean, responsibility? So, if you look at FAR 9.104-4, and it essentially talks about responsible contractors, okay? And responsible contractors must be able to meet the contract terms, have satisfactory performance, have or able to obtain necessary financial resources, business/technical skills, and equipment / facilities needed to perform on the contract, and then also be qualified and eligible to receive government awards. Okay, so that's what it means to be a responsible contractor. And again, just to repeat, because I think it's very important, as a prime or upper tier subcontractor, it is your responsibility to make sure the subcontractors meet these criteria that I have mentioned here. Because I work for DCAA, and the focus of DCAA is really the audit requirements. I'll really focus in and hone in during this presentation. I'll really talk more, along the lines of those financial and auditing type of requirements. Just understand there could be a lot of, there could be a lot of other responsibilities that are not necessarily aligned with financial or auditing. And obviously you would be responsible for those as well, but I can't speak to those not nearly as well as the financial and auditing aspects of the clause, right? So let me go ahead and move forward. Let's talk about FAR 44.204A. Basically what this says is this provides, essentially what this says is the contracting officer shall insert FAR 52.2442, which is subcontracts and solicitations and contracts when contemplating the following. So essentially, when the contracting officer issues the following contracts, it will contain the FAR 52.244-2 subcontracts clause, right? So any cost reimbursable contract. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. If you are awarded any cost reimbursable contract, just understand the subcontract clause 52.244-2 shall be inserted into that contract. Okay. A letter contract that exceeds the simplified acquisition threshold, a T&M contract, a labor hour contract, and a fixed price contract that all exceed the simplified acquisition threshold, right? So those last four contract types have to exceed the simplified acquisition threshold in order to have FAR 52.244-2. Okay, if those contracts are under the simplified acquisition threshold, then you're not going to see that clause. The threshold for simplified acquisition is, I believe, $250,000, right? That's the threshold. That's the current threshold, at least, or I should say, the last time I looked at it, that was the threshold. Okay. Okay. Now let's talk about our next topic here, and this is an important topic. This is an important concept, and a good bit of the presentation will be devoted to this idea of consent to subcontract. Okay, so what we're saying here is, whoops, I thought I was on the wrong slide. So what we're saying here is essentially contractors, or again, upper tier subcontractors. Okay, you are not free to automatically subcontract out to anyone that you want to subcontract out the work. Okay, that's the idea of consent to subcontract. So essentially what you need to do is you need to obtain consent from the federal government, right? So again, consent to subcontract, that's part of FAR 52.244-2. And I just mentioned in our previous slide, right, that clause will be inserted into any number of contracts that we had talked about, right? Any cost reimbursable contract or any of the other types that exceed the simplified acquisition threshold. Okay, so please keep that in mind. All right, now let's talk about your approved purchasing system, because that ties in, right? It's related to consent to subcontract. Okay, for small businesses, this is pretty straightforward, because what we're saying here is if a contractor has an approved purchasing system, okay, if you have an approved purchasing system, then the contracting officer may still require consent for certain subcontracts, right? If you do not have an approved purchasing system, then consent to subcontract is required. And again, as a small business, okay, 99.9% of small businesses are not going to have an approved purchasing system. Okay, and I'm fairly certain that really that number is probably 100% of small businesses are not going to have a purchasing system audit. The purchasing system is actually performed by DCMA. DCMA is Defense Contract Management Agency. They are not the same thing as DCAA. We are two separate agencies. And I know for a fact that DCMA has policies and procedures on when they will perform a purchasing system audit, and generally those thresholds are pretty high. So meaning you have to be I'm not saying you have to be a Lockheed Martin or a Boeing, but you got to be you got to be a fairly large contractor, right? So if you're on the small end or even kind of a mid-size or a medium size, then there's a high chance that you won't have an approved purchasing system audit. So ultimately what that means is automatically you will need to obtain consent prior to subcontracting out the work. So that's all. I kind of said a lot of words basically just to to tell you that more than likely you will need to obtain consent. All right. Okay, so let's again, we're still talking about consent to subcontract. So what does this mean, or how do you obtain consent, right? What is the process? What does that look like, right? So, basically what you should do, you should require or notify the contracting officer in advance, right? It says reasonably in advance, okay, of placing any subcontract or modification thereof for which consent is required, and provide the following information. Okay, so you want to provide what are the services or supplies that you intend on subcontracting. You want to identify the subcontract type, okay, whether it's fixed price, whether it's cost plus, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, you want to identify the proposed subcontractor. You also want to include the proposed subcontract price, and then also, if applicable, a negotiation memorandum. Okay. All right. Moving on to the next slide. Okay. I do want to talk about I guess maybe, if you take a look at FAR 52.24-2, it does talk about subcontractors I should say, in many situations, when you negotiate with the government, you may include subcontractors within your proposal. And so what we're saying here is, even though you might have a cost proposal that includes specific subcontractors, this does not in of itself satisfy the requirements for advanced notification. Okay, so that's kind of what I was trying to say. I might have muddled it a little bit, but essentially, yeah, what I'm trying to say is, just because you negotiate with the government and your cost proposal includes subcontractors, this in of itself does not satisfy that requirement. So as a result, you would still need to obtain consent. Okay, so just keep that in mind. All right, let me go move on to the next slide and talk about FAR 52.244-2F. And again, this is still consent to subcontract. And what we say here is, unless the consent or approval specifically provides otherwise, neither consent by the contracting officer or any other subcontract nor approval of the contractor's purchasing system shall constitute a determination of the acceptability of any subcontract terms or conditions, okay, the allowability of any costs under the contract, or to relieve the contractor of any responsibility for performing this contract. So essentially, bottom line, at the end of the day, if you have an approved purchasing system, or if you have consent to subcontract, as the prime or upper tier subcontractor, you are still required to monitor your subcontracts. You are still required, or you're still responsible, for ensuring that, the entire subcontract, the terms and conditions of the contract are met, right? To also include the allowability of costs, right? So if a subcontractor submits an invoice to you, you're still required to make sure the costs that the subcontractor is submitting, those costs are allowable and allocable per the contract terms and conditions, right? So all those responsibilities as a prime are still in effect. That's basically what this is saying. You know, I kind of see this, you know, I kind of laugh a little bit because I'm sure a lawyer wrote this, and you know, essentially it's basically a CYA for the government, right? I mean, that's really what this is. Okay, but I think it's still important just to mention that ultimately, you know, as a prime repetier, again, you're still responsible for managing your subcontracts, managing your subcontractors, to include all of those things that I mentioned. Okay. All right. Let me go and move on. Let's talk about the purchasing system just quickly, and I won't get into this in too much detail, but I think it is worthwhile maybe talking about some of the requirements just so you understand what they are, because obviously it's a good idea to kind of know what these requirements are, because again, these you would be required to maintain to make sure that you're complying with these, even though I mentioned earlier, you know, DCMA isn't going to come around and perform an audit, but again, you would still be required to maintain policies and procedures and a system that meets these criteria. So I think it's good to know a little bit about what you know what this says. And if you wanted to look at it more, it's really it's in DFARS 252-44. Actually, it's supposed to be dot 252.244-7001. That's where the contracting purchasing system clause is located. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide. Okay, if we look at this more closely, there's actually 24 criteria. And again, like I said, I won't go through each of these, but I'll sort of highlight some of them. Okay, so if we look at one of them here in C1, you know, you want to make sure you have an adequate system description, including policies, procedures, and purchasing practices that comply with FAR and DFARS, right? So, you know, if you've you know, if any of you have ever attended the accounting system requirements that presentations that I've given in the past, you know, I'm sure most of you will know that, you know, one of the things that I really focus on is having adequate policies and procedures. Okay, and the purchasing system is no different. So I highly recommend, you know, to you out there that if you, not in addition to the accounting system requirements, right, you want to make sure you have policies and procedures that adequately describe your purchasing practices, because that's extremely important as well. Okay. So moving on, if we talk, you know, if we look at a few more of these criteria, okay, you want to make sure that you're that all applicable purchase orders and subcontracts contain all flow down clauses, including terms and conditions and any other clauses needed to carry out the requirements of the prime contract. So again, you know, if you issue, let's say, for example, you issue a cost plus fixed fee subcontract, okay, well, guess what? The allowable cost of payment clause is a mandatory flow down clause. Okay, and so many of you out there, you know, I'm sure you know, the allowable cost of payment clause, one of the criteria is submitting an annual incurred cost proposal. Okay, so again, if you're the one that is you know, awarding a cost type contract to a subcontractor, you have to make sure that that clause flows down to the subcontractor, because the subcontractor needs to submit an incurred cost proposal because they're being awarded a cost type contract, right? So that's what this means, right? And that's just one example, but there are many flow down clauses that, you know, that you have to make sure that are in the subcontract agreement. Okay. You want to also make sure that purchase orders are based on authorized requisitions that include a complete and accurate history of purchase transactions to support vendors selected, price paid, and document subcontract purchase order files, which are subject to government review. So again, this should all be part of your policies and procedures. Okay, and you know what I would say is, if any of you have taken my proposal adequacy presentation, one of the things I talk about is adequate subcontract analysis when reviewing subcontractor proposed costs, right? And that's part of your purchasing system. So you want to make sure that you have adequate policies and procedures in place that describe, what you should do when you receive a vendor quote or some sort of purchase order or a subcontract proposal. You want to make sure that you perform adequate analysis to make sure that those prices are fair and reasonable. Okay, so that's another example, right? So I won't go through all of these, okay, but I do think I do think these are important. So I do recommend you, whenever you have time, take a look. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of roll through. Let's talk about proposal responsibilities, and I touched upon this a little bit. Okay, so let's talk. So as a prime or upper tier subcontractor, what are your responsibilities as it relates to the proposal stage or pre-award stage? Okay, and so typically this will be, in a situation where, you have a cost proposal that you're submitting to the government, and within that proposal, you have subcontract costs. Okay, so again, as the prime or upper tier, it's important that you conduct appropriate cost or price analysis to establish the reasonableness of the proposed subcontract price, right? When required by FAR 15403-C3, submit or cause the subcontractor to submit the subcontractor certified cost of pricing data to the government. Okay, so the certification, again, I talk about this in my proposal adequacy training seminar, but the current threshold for certification is $2 million, right? So if the subcontractor's proposal is $2 million or more, then they are subject to that same certification as would you, the prime, right? So as the prime, if your proposal was $2 million or more, you would be required to submit a certification as well, right? So this is a mandatory flow down clause for subcontractors. Okay, so that's a couple of things that you want to keep in mind for proposal responsibilities. Okay, let's talk about price analysis quickly. So price analysis is the process of examining and evaluating a proposed price without evaluating its separate cost elements. So if the subcontractor submits, let's say their total proposal is $3 million, then performing adequate price analysis would be evaluating that $3 million, right? As you know, many of you out there know, the $3 million consists of many elements, right? Direct costs, indirect costs, profit, fee, labor, et cetera, right? But again, with price analysis, it's only reviewing that total price. Okay. All right. Now let's talk about these are some examples that you could perform. Okay. Again, as a prime or upper tier subcontractor, you could perform some of these. Okay. Compare the proposed price received in response to the solicitation. Compare the proposed price to historical prices, right? So obviously that would probably require obtaining some data from the subcontractor. You may want to use parametric estimating methods or applications. Compare with competitive published price lists, published market prices of commodities, right? So there could be some salaries, some survey data out there that you could possibly use. Comparison of proposed price with independent government cost estimates. Comparison of proposed price with prices obtained through market research. Okay, and then analysis of data other than certified cost of price data. All right, so these are some examples. Okay, certainly not an exhaustive list. Certainly some ideas there. Okay. All right, let's move on to cost analysis. Cost analysis is the review and evaluation of any of the separate cost elements and profit or fee in the subcontractor's proposal. Okay. Cost analysis is used to evaluate the reasonableness of individual cost elements when certified cost of pricing data is required. So again, if the subcontractor's proposal meets the $2 million threshold, and so if it's $2 million or more, then the subcontractor is required to certify. In addition to that, you as the prime or upper tier, you are then required to perform cost analysis because certified cost or pricing data was required. I didn't mention this, but as for a price analysis could be used when certified cost or pricing data is not required. So if the subcontractor's proposal is under the 2 million threshold, then you could perform price analysis, right? All right, some examples of cost analysis. You could verify the cost data, verification of cost data or pricing data and evaluation of the cost elements. You could evaluate the effect of the offeror's current practices on future costs, compare the cost proposed by the offeror for individual cost elements. Okay, and then verification of the offeror's cost submissions are in accordance with foreign CAS, if applicable, right? So basically, does the subcontractor's costs, are they in accordance with the subcontract terms and conditions, right? So for example, let's say you negotiate a subcontract with a vendor, and within the subcontract terms and conditions, it says, travel cost is limited to, let's say, $2,000. Okay, so that if you had that kind of condition or criteria within the subcontract terms and conditions, then when you're reviewing the subcontractor's proposal, you want to make sure that their proposed costs, the travel costs more specifically, is in accordance with that criteria, right? So I kind of just made that up, but that's what they're referring to there. All right, let's go ahead and move on. So this is, I don't want to say this is a common scenario, but this does happen. I've seen it personally. So what happens if the subcontractor denies you access to their accounting system, which obviously prohibits you from performing a cost analysis? Okay, so again, that does happen. Well, what you could do is you could perform a price analysis, right? So instead of looking at the particular cost elements, you could look at the total price in general. Okay, you could perform a cost analysis on the elements of the proposal that you can perform. So, the subcontractor might say, I don't want to release my labor data because that's proprietary, but you could look at my, here's information on my on my material costs, right? So obviously, you don't have access to the labor information, but you do have access to their material costs. So you could review their material cost element and perform a cost analysis on that, right? And then finally, seek assistance from the ACO, right? Reach out to your government point of contact, let them know that the subcontractor denied access. Okay, in some cases, what they could do is they could ask DCAA to perform an audit or some review of the subcontractor. Okay, because at the end of the day, right, ultimately the government wants to make sure that all costs are fair and reasonable, right? Not only the prime costs, but also the subcontract costs, right? And like I said before, the prime is responsible for the subcontract costs, but if the subcontractor is denying access to the records, then that is ultimately that prevents the government from ensuring that the subcontractor costs are fair and reasonable. So in some situations, we may get involved and sort of take it upon ourselves to review the subcontract costs. Okay. All right. So let's talk about some examples of inadequate subcontract analysis, right? So these are things that you should not do. Okay. So if you didn't do anything, right? If you didn't perform any cost or price analysis, or if you didn't document it, that would certainly be inadequate. Okay. If you fail to support the degree of competition or basis for establishing the source selection or price reasonableness. Okay. So understand in order to have adequate competition, there are a number of criteria that you have to meet. If you fail to support that, then that would be inadequate. Okay. Same thing with failure to perform a commercial item determination. And then again, no documentation on attempts to perform analysis. And this is the most important part here, if you don't notify the government when you are denied access, then obviously the government has, we're not going to have any idea that you were denied access to those records. And then the risk would be is the subcontractor proposed costs are, either overly inflated or grossly underestimated, right? So that's the risk. So please let us know if that happens. Okay. All right. Now there is some, if you have, and if we do find that contractors have inadequate policies and procedures, related to subcontract analysis, there could be some impact there, potentially, an estimating system deficiency. There could be increased audit time and support costs. Okay, certainly during a proposal, right? If we find the prime has inadequate subcontract analysis, that would certainly result in a longer audit, right? Which would take longer for you to support, and that increase support costs. And then that will also, that increased audit time generally will delay negotiations, right? So that's generally not, that's something that really nobody likes. Okay. All right, let's move on to the incurred costs, right? Incurred costs, responsibilities. Again, this is pretty straightforward. I mentioned this earlier. If you're a prime or upper tier subcontractor and you issue a cost type subcontract, the allowable cost of payment clause, which is FAR 52.216-7, this is a mandatory flow down clause, and this should flow down to the subcontract terms and conditions. And in effect, this would require the subcontractor to submit to the prime their incur cost proposal, right? That is essentially what your responsibility is as a prime, is to make sure the allowable cost of payment clause is in the subcontract terms and conditions, and then also to review the subcontractor's incur cost proposal. Okay. Let's see here. I'm gonna go ahead and move on. Let's talk about Schedule J very quickly here. And basically, if you have subcontracts, okay, whether you're a prime or upper tier, if you have subcontracts, then you must submit Schedule J with your incur cost proposal. That's essentially what this is. Okay. And again, if you've taken my incur cost submission presentation, I'm sure you've heard me talk about Schedule J. But this is one of the required schedules within your incur cost proposal. And essentially, you need to provide the following information. You need to provide the name of the subcontractor, the prime and subcontract numbers, the value, the subcontract value, and the type of the subcontract, and then also the amount the subcontractor incurred during the fiscal year. Okay. It's basically just like I said, it's a schedule, and it's just a matrix that includes all this information. So I think it's pretty straightforward. All right, let's talk about some deficiencies. Again, I've said this several times before, but failure to notify the ACO and obtain approval to subcontract, right? That's a big one. So again, you have to obtain consent prior to working with a subcontractor or a vendor. Okay, fail to perform appropriate cost or price analysis, fail to appropriately monitor subcontract effort, and then the final one, fail to request a denial of access and notify the ACO when the subcontractor refuses access to their accounting system, right? So that's very important as well. Okay, and these are some other common deficiencies: fail to verify the subcontractor has an adequate accounting system. I didn't mention this earlier. But again, if you award a subcontractor a cost plus fixed fee, then the accounting system requirements flow down as well. It's an automatic flow down. And that means the subcontractor must maintain an adequate accounting system and the prime or upper tier subcontractor is responsible for making that determination, right? So you're responsible for going in and making sure that their system complies with all the criteria, right? And I spoke about the criteria in my accounting system presentation. Okay, so I would look at these, but these really kind of just align to a lot of the things that I talked about. Okay, so we're sort of wrapping up here. This is basically just a big summary, right? Again, it's very important. And just because you're a small business doesn't mean you can't be a subcontractor, or I should say, doesn't mean that you can't be a prime contractor. In many cases, you could be a first or second tier subcontractor, right? So you want to know what your responsibilities are, and then also don't assume that you can subcontract, right? You want to make sure that you get consent prior to subcontracting. And then also, if you are a subcontractor, know what is required of the prime. So if you know what you need to do as a prime, okay, when you're in a situation where you're a sub, you know what those responsibilities are. And so it's much, it's much easier to be in that position working with a potential prime. All right. Okay, guys, and that's the end of my presentation. So I think I said a lot here. If there's any questions or any comments, I would be more than happy to address those at this time.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. Very informative as always. We appreciate that because we know that this is not exactly an exciting topic, but it's an important one.
That's right.
It's not one of the glamorous
no,
classes
it is
we
not.
teach, but you
Yeah.
make it understandable. And that's the
Thank
important
you.
thing. So it doesn't look like there are any questions. I don't see any in the chat box. Somebody's asked me a question as to, do we offer any classes related to costs, proposals, pricing and rates? And we do have a couple scheduled for next year. And I put the link in the chat box for our training calendar. So please feel free to sign up for those and learn the basics on how to get the costing and pricing and rates.
Yeah. So Yasmin, I actually have a new presentation that I created. It's called indirect cost and indirect rate cost and allocations. So I don't know if that would be valuable to your small business space, but I do talk a little bit more in detail about overhead expenses and G&A and what's a pool, what's a base,
yeah,
and
definitely.
that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I'll reach out to you to schedule that. But yeah, anything like that would be very helpful.
Okay, then.
All right. Okay, great. Well, seeing as we have no questions, I'd like to thank Joe for doing this presentation, and we will be scheduling him again for next year. And I'd like to thank you all for showing up today and increasing your GovCon knowledge. So take care, everybody, and we will see you on a future PTAC webinar. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.